I've been asked to give an introductory talk about intelligent design and what it is and what the theory holds. And for me, that's really a very fitting assignment because I had the good fortune of being here in the great state of Texas back in the 1980s, in the mid-80s. Early in my career, I was a geophysicist for an oil company. And I got to meet some of the scientists who were first formulating the modern theory of intelligent design, including a chemist named Charles Thaxton and one of his key colleagues, Walter Bradley, who was then a professor of polymer science and engineering at Texas A&M University. And so I'll be giving an introductory talk, and in a sense I had the good fortune of being there when all this got started. My own personal history with intelligent design starts from the mid-'80s. There was a conference that came to Dallas. I had been working in the oil industry as a geophysicist, and I had been posted here to Houston for a while. I spent most of my time in Dallas, and in 1985 this conference came to town, and one of the sessions in this scientific conference was about the question of the origin of the first life. The other two sessions were about the origin of the universe and the origin and nature of human consciousness. So it was one of those really heady academic events where you had the big questions in science that intersect with the big questions in philosophy all being discussed. And I had the good fortune at this conference of meeting Dr. Charles Thaxton, who gave a talk on his then new book called The Mystery of Life's Origin. And I found myself fascinated with his work. He, in his book, expressed very specific scientific doubts and skepticism about the standard evolutionary theory for the origin of the first life. And the book became a best-selling college-level treatment of this very difficult problem, the origin of the first life, how you get life from simple non-living chemicals. I became fascinated with that topic and had the good fortune, as I said, of meeting Thaxton at just the time in my life when I was considering myself going on to graduate school. And a year later, in 1986, I found myself enrolled at Cambridge University in the philosophy of science, and later ended up doing a dissertation of my own on the origin of life problem. Now, as you might imagine, going from the oil patch with a lot of good old backslapping good old boys to Cambridge, England was quite a culture shock. The English academic male is so introverted that I used to beg my wife not to leave me alone with these guys because they just couldn't make conversation. And that was a big change from, the how you doing y'all thing down here, so. But at any rate, it was a bit of a transition, and I found that on occasion I stuck my foot in it over there. In one of the first, it was my first term in Cambridge, there was a very distinguished visiting professor who came to lecture on the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And I had one course on Kant's philosophy as an undergraduate, but really had very rudimentary knowledge, as I soon found out. And the prof was talking about some aspect of Kantian philosophy that I really had never heard of. And so I raised my hand in the middle of the lecture and asked if I could get a reference where I could learn more about that aspects of Kant's philosophy, because I admitted that I knew nothing about it. Well, there was this kind of pall that came over the room. It became very quiet. Afterwards, my supervisor, Professor Hoskin, an English don of the old school, took me aside and he said, Meyer, he said, I know in the States you've learned that the only stupid question is the one you didn't ask. And then he said, it's different here. And he went on to explain that in future, he said, if you have a question that reveals ignorance, come and ask me privately, he said. So I tell you that because after my introductory talk on intelligent design, my good colleague, Dr. Bill Dembski, is going to give a talk that will go a little deeper and elaborate some of the basic concepts I'll be explaining. And then after that, we're going to have a question and answer session jointly together. And we wanted you to know it's American rules. Okay. No question will be deemed too stupid to have been asked. So we're looking forward to that interaction with you and that conversation. Now, even though intelligent design got started back in the mid-'80s, it really didn't break into public awareness until about 10 years ago. In fact, it was right about 10 years ago, 2004, that suddenly those of us who were developing the theory of intelligent design, writing important books like Bill Dembski's Design Inference or Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box, suddenly found ourselves in the news. And the occasion for this was the result of several different news stories. The first occurred in 2004 when one of the leading atheists in the world, Anthony Flew, announced that he was no longer an atheist, that he had come to believe in some kind of a deity. And one of the reasons for that was the incredibly complex information embedded in the DNA molecule. And he went on to explain in several of these news stories that his views were very much like these American design theorists. It happens, I'll tell you a little secret, that Dr. Flew was at that same 1985 conference that I attended, where he also heard Dr. Thaxton speak. Later that same year, Wired magazine did a cover story on the theory of intelligent design, and those of us who were working on it, their reporter came out to Seattle, and we had a long 3-hour conversation about the nanotechnology inside cells, the digital information that makes cells run, and much to our surprise, when the story came out, it was headlined, "The Plot to Kill Evolution Inside the Crusade to Bring Creationism 2.0 into America's Classrooms." And this was in fact the story that portrayed us as diabolical, theocratic conspirators attempting to force religion into the American public schools. Later that year, there was a controversy in one of the American public schools in a little town, Dover, Pennsylvania. You may remember the controversy about it. That precipitated a cover story in Time magazine about the evolution wars and specifically about intelligent design, which was described by Time magazine as a faith-based idea, a faith-based idea. And in that same window of time, there was also this extraordinary controversy involving Dr. Richard Sternberg, a biologist who was then working at the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History and also at the National Institutes of Health. He had a joint appointment in the federal science establishment. He had 2 earned PhDs, and he made the mistake of publishing or allowing to go through the peer review process an article which argued for the theory of intelligent design. I did happen to be the author of that. There was an ironic comment made in the Wall Street Journal when some of the terrible things that happened to Dr. Sternberg started to come out in the media. I maybe ought to mention those. After the article was published, it was quiet at the Smithsonian for about a week, and then everything erupted. And soon his keys were taken away, his access to his scientific samples. He was denied access to his office. He was transferred from underneath the supervisorship of a longtime friendly supervisor and colleague into a different part of the museum altogether, where he was then overseen by hostile administrators. Later, a congressional committee which investigated his case found out by following the email thread that there had in fact been a very concerted attempt to discredit Sternberg with a campaign of disinformation and rumors. It was said that he was a Catholic priest and not a scientist, that he had no degrees in science, that he had worked for the Bush campaign, and on and on and on. And eventually he was demoted. So later, and you may have learned about his case from watching the Ben Stein film in 2008 and 2009, Ben Stein got word of this, found out that there were many other similar cases involving scientists who were questioning Darwinian evolution, and he ended up making this very interesting film, Expelled, about it, which brought the theory of intelligent design yet more into public focus. And so what I want to talk about today is what exactly is the theory of intelligent design, and why does it inspire such determined attempts to suppress it and to suppress the advocates of the theory. What is this rival doctrine of which Professor Richard Dawkins was speaking in that opening clip? Well, perhaps the best way to understand the theory of intelligent design is by contrast to the proposition, the key proposition that it has been formulated to challenge. Richard Dawkins is the leading spokesman for modern Darwinian theory known as neo-Darwinism. And he has put it very succinctly. We appreciate him for his clarity. This is what he says: biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Now we have a teacher desk here for me, so I'm going to play teacher for a minute and give you a quiz. What is the key word in that statement from a neo-Darwinian point of view? Excellent. A's for everyone. Okay, the Darwinian view, and this goes back to Darwin, but it has been the view of Darwinians and modern neo-Darwinians ever since, is the idea that life looks as though it were designed by a purposive intelligence, but it's not really designed. Instead, it's not really designed because there is an unguided, undirected process known as natural selection, acting on random variations, and modern neo-Darwinists would now say random mutations. Natural selection acting on random variations and mutations, which can produce the appearance of design. In other words, it's an unguided natural mechanism that has the powers to mimic, that has the ability to mimic the powers of a designing intelligence, but which itself is not guided or directed or intelligent in any way or form. Okay? So that's the Darwinian view. You have design without a designer. Design without a designer. In fact, that's the title of a very recent article by Francisco Ayala, a leading Darwinian biologist. We have design, the appearance of design, without an actual designer. Now that sounds so counterintuitive to people outside biology that I like to explain the logic of this, because it's really important to feel the force of the Darwinian argument. And this idea of design without a designer goes back to Darwin himself. In fact, it's in the third chapter of The Origin of Species where he lays out the logic of natural selection as a substitute for an actual designing intelligence. During the 19th century, biologists were very impressed with what seemed to most of them, until Darwin's time, an overwhelming evidence of design. And that evidence was often described as adaptation. No matter what organism you look at, the organism seems to be well adapted to the environment in which it lives. So as a little boy, I was fascinated with fish. On fishing trips, I used to get in trouble for cranking the fish various different ways, but I was fascinated by those swim bladders. You know, they have little balloons that inflate, that keep them at the right buoyancy. It seemed really cool. And you look at a fish, it's got gills that allow it to extract oxygen from the water, it's got a swim bladder, it's got a lateral line, it has all these wonderful adaptations or innovations that allow it to live in the water. And the same thing is true of nearly every organism. And the explanation that seemed overwhelmingly compelling to biologists in the 19th century was that of design. The reason that organisms have the attributes that are necessary to live in a particular environment, in fact, the environment in which they live, is that they were designed to live in that environment. They were given those attributes, those features, those characteristics that they needed. Now, Darwin came along and said, I think actually I can explain adaptation without a designer. Now, and here's how it goes. Let's imagine, well, let me give you one other little piece of background information. One other thing that 19th century biologists knew about very well was what is called selective breeding. In fact, selective breeding has been known and understood from biblical times. You have this way back in the book of Genesis. But the idea of selective breeding was that you can alter the attributes or features of a population of organisms by choosing which males and which females you are going to allow to breed out of a group of animals or offspring. Let's imagine, for example, that we are sheep herders in the far north of Scotland, and we want to breed a woollier breed of sheep. What do? Well, we take the woolliest male and the woolliest ewe, and we allow only them to breed. And then we get a new group, herd of sheep, you get herd of sheep? School? Flock, thank you. I knew there was a technical term out there waiting for me. Okay, so you get a new flock of sheep, anyway, you get more sheepies. And you pick the woolliest male again, woolliest female, and you do that generation after generation after generation. What do you end up with at the end of that process? Very woolly sheep, okay? And then you can make a lot of nice Scottish sweaters and things, okay? So now, in other words, with the intelligent guidance of the breeder, you could change the attributes of the group of animals. And in this case, change them so that they're very woolly in a very cold climate. So what do you have? You're enhancing the adaptive ability of the sheep to the climate in which they live. Now, this was Darwin's genius. This is where he came along. And he said, well, he didn't use this example, but run with it for a minute. He said, what if instead of the intelligent breeder doing the selecting, what if nature does the selecting? What if instead of me choosing the woolliest males and woolliest females in each generation, there's a series of very cold winters, such that only the woolliest survive in each generation? Won't you get at the end of that process, won't you get the very same outcome? But in this case, in the Darwinian case, you don't have an intelligence guiding it. It's just nature doing the work. The cold winters killing off all but the very woolliest. And that was his idea, that nature could do the selecting. Nature could replace the breeder, or nature could replace the intelligent agent that was responsible for the key evidence of design as perceived by 19th century biologists, which was adaptation. And that's the essence of Darwinism. Now, Darwin was therefore very clear about this. There was people who wanted to say, well, maybe natural selection is a guided or directed process. He says, no, you don't understand. The whole point is that it's natural selection, not intelligent selection. And so he emphatically, in one of the letters that he wrote after the publication of The Origin of Species, made this denial of design very explicit. He said there seems to be no more variability of organic beings in the action of natural selection than in the course in which the wind blows. It is an undirected process. It's nature just doing what nature does. And so the core of Darwinism is this idea that the appearance of design, in 19th century terms, adaptation, has resulted from a purely undirected natural or material process. Most importantly, the process of natural selection acting on random variations, and we would now today talk about mutations as well. Mutations are copying errors in the DNA molecule. Now, that gets us finally to the idea of intelligent design. Intelligent design is the idea that there are key features of living systems that are best explained not by an undirected process such as natural selection and random variations, but instead by an actual designing intelligence. That we see the appearance of design very often because that appearance is indicating an actual design. That things look designed because they really were designed. Living organisms look designed because they really were designed. Now, in saying this, it's important to understand what we're not saying, we advocates of the theory of intelligent design. We are not denying several of the meanings of evolution. Evolution can mean several things. It can mean change over time, first of all. And that itself can have a couple of different meanings. Change over time could refer to the idea that life now, the things that are alive today, the organisms that are alive today are different than some of the organisms that were alive a long time ago. If you go back in the geologic column, lower and lower, in the lower strata, you find fossil remains of organisms and animals that no longer live today. I'll be talking a lot tomorrow about trilobites from the Cambrian period, or triceratopses from the Cretaceous. So advocates of intelligent design are not denying that life has changed over time, nor are we denying that there is change over time that occurs in our present observable timescale. For example, we see the Galapagos finches changing in response to changing weather patterns, beaks getting longer or shorter as a result of changing weather, the kind of small scale, what biologists often call microevolutionary variation. So intelligent design is not denying that. There's a second meaning of evolution, and intelligent design is not denying this meaning either. This is the idea of universal common descent. And you may remember that part of Darwin's theory was a picture of the history of life, wherein he portrayed the process of evolution beginning from one or very few simple, probably one-celled organisms, and then those organisms gradually morphing and changing so that all the forms of life today are related by common ancestry to forms of life that lived a long time ago. And he depicted the history of life as a great branching tree, where the root or trunk of the tree represented the first life the branches at the top, all the forms of life we see today, and the branches in the middle, those forms that morphed gradually from that first simple form to what we have today. Now, the theory of intelligent design is not actually challenging this idea, though many advocates of intelligent design, perhaps me in particular, are skeptical of this. I am very profoundly skeptical that this is the right picture of the history of life, but this is not the proposition. Intelligent design is not denying the idea of universal common descent. Instead, it has a different proposition in its crosshairs. We instead are challenging the idea, a third meaning of evolution. The idea that natural selection or other similarly undirected processes are sufficient to account for all the change that might have occurred in the history of life and the appearance of design that living organisms manifest. The Darwinian idea, again, is that the natural selection random mutation process is essentially a very creative process that can produce an unlimited amount of change, such that it is the causal agent for all the forms of life we see today. We are challenging that. We don't think that that undirected process can do what the neo-Darwinians say it can do. And we especially don't think that it is responsible for many of the key appearances of design that excite our interest and imagination. And I will talk about some of those things as we proceed. So if we look at the three definitions of evolution, we have the trivial meaning of change over time. Intelligent design is not challenging that. We have a more controversial meaning, universal common descent. And while some advocates of intelligent design may be skeptical of that, that's not really the main thing we're challenging. But the third meaning of evolution is this idea that natural selection is the chief cause of new biological form and the appearance of design, and that proposition we are in fact challenging. So the key issue that in biology and in fact in nature itself is this: is the appearance of design that we see in nature real or illusory? Is it real or imaginary? Is it real or just an appearance? Now, advocates of intelligent design argue that the evidence of that there is evidence of real design, not just the appearance of design. And we say that largely because of things that have been discovered since Darwin's time that he didn't know about. In fact, you could think, if you go back to the 19th century, you could reframe the whole debate about Darwinian evolution this way. Is adaptation the only appearance of design? And if not, has Darwinian evolution or other similarly undirected processes explained those other appearances of design? Is adaptation the only thing that we should be thinking about as biologists or about or as natural scientists, or might there be other evidences of design in biology or in nature? Well, I turn first to a class of evidence that really isn't in biology at all, but it's something that has revived the argument from design in nature. In fact, it's often said that Darwin's great legacy was to refute the classical design argument by showing that the appearance of design was an illusion. But in a completely separate field, physics, physicists have been discovering a very curious set of coincidences that have made many physicists begin to think that they're looking at evidence of design in the realm of physics. And then sometimes this class of evidence is called the Anthropic Fine-Tuning. Anthros for man, fine-tuning the idea that we live in essentially a Goldilocks universe. Not too hot, not too cold, where all the forces of physics are just right. The speed of light is not too fast, not too slow. The universe is expanding at just the right rate, etc., etc. That as physicists have begun to quantify the various fundamental forces of physics, what are called the constants of the laws of physics, they have found that these attributes of the physical world have very precise numerical values. And these values make it possible for life to exist. And moreover, if these different features, the fundamental features of the world, the strength of gravitational attraction or the expansion rate of the universe, were just a little tiny bit different. In the case of the expansion rate of the universe, it's apparently fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60th power. That's like $1 out of $1 trillion dollars. Not much in relation to the federal budget deficit, but nevertheless, incredibly finely tuned. Engineers are familiar with the concept of tolerances, where you've got to get it just right within a very fine, that nut and that bolt have to go together, and there's only a little tiny bit of wiggle room. Turns out we live in a universe where there's not much wiggle room, or else there would not be life. And so this has raised the question, why are all these fundamental parameters of the universe so exquisitely finely tuned to allow for life? And there's a great Cambridge physicist named John Polkinghorne who has a wonderful visual illustration, or he does this verbally, but I've made a slide to get across his idea. He says, imagine you are going out in space, maybe you're on Star Trek: The Next Generation, and you come to a space ship, or a space station way out in space, and you dock your spacecraft there, and it's got a sign on the top, and it says, Universe Creating Machine. You think, this is an interesting place. So you go inside, and sure enough, there's all these dials and knobs and sliders, and each one of them apparently is a setting for one of the fundamental features of the universe. And so you're a physicist, and you soon realize that if you change things a little bit and you make some calculations, you realize, boy, if I change the expansion rate of the universe, even that tiny little bit, we'd have a recollapse of the universe, and we'd have a big crunch. Or if I changed it a little bit and made it go a little bit faster, we'd have a heat death, where all the energy of the universe would dissipate too quickly to form stable galaxies and rocky planets and all the things that are needed for life. And as you go one by one down through all these different dials, all these different parameters, you realize the universe is incredibly finely tuned, such that it looks as though perhaps it was, well, what? Fred Hoyle, longtime atheist agnostic physicist, discovered one of these fine-tuning parameters, the magnetic resonance levels of the carbon atom. And he describes how he walked into the laboratory that day before he did the experiment as an agnostic/atheist and walked out as a theist. And when asked what he makes of the fine-tuning, he said this: a common-sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology. So one of the arguments for design that has developed as a result of discoveries in modern science is this argument from the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics. Let's look at another class of evidence where the idea of intelligent design has come back into currency. This is not in physics, but in the field of biology. And one of the extraordinary discoveries of the last 30 years in biology is the discovery of nanotechnology, miniature machines inside cells. The cell is the smallest unit of life. And even in one-celled organisms, in simple bacteria, we find exquisite machinery. And my colleague Michael Behe, in his book Darwin's Black Box back in 1996, first made famous for a wide audience some of this exquisite machinery. And one of those machines was something called the bacterial flagellar motor. And this is an animation still of that. We might actually just dim the bright lights for just a minute. I'm not getting enough contrast to make sure everyone can see this. But this is just an extraordinary little machine. It's a rotary engine, and it turns at 100,000 RPM in some bacterial species. It has a rotor, a stator, a U-shaped, a U-joint, a propeller-like tail that allows the bacterium to propel itself through liquid. It's hardwired into a signal transduction circuit, which allows the bacterium to change directions on a quarter turn of the rotary engine to chase down the food supply. So it's an extraordinary piece of high technology in low life. It's high tech and low life. And Michael Behe has argued that systems like this are very difficult to explain by reference to Darwinian evolution. The natural selection is a mechanism that selects for functional advantage. That is, if a variation arises which confers an advantage in the competition for survival on an organism, that new feature is passed on to the next generation. So natural selection as a mechanism selects for functional advantage. But in systems like this, there's a difficulty in using that principle to explain the origin of such systems. Why? Well, because this system has no functional advantage until many different independent parts are all brought into close functional integration. So we know, for example, this machine is made of roughly 30 protein parts. And if you knock out one of those protein parts, you disable a gene for building one of those parts, we know that the 29 part, the 28 part, the 27 part, the 26 part version of this motor doesn't work. It doesn't spin. It doesn't provide any propulsion, no functional advantage. So if you're trying to build a motor like this up gradually, step by step in a Darwinian fashion, you find that there are big gaps where there's no functional advantage in getting from A to B or from B to N or whatever. And so Behe argues this is not the kind of system that can be explained by natural selection. This is an appearance of design. Clearly, this appears to be design. It's a rotary engine. But it's an appearance of design that cannot and has not been explained in the scientific literature by the outworking of the gradual Darwinian mechanism of natural selection and random variation. And so he argues that a much more rational inference is to say, hey, it looks designed. We don't have an alternative non-design explanation. Therefore, the best explanation is that it really is designed. And in fact, I would go further and argue that whenever we see this type of functional integration, or what Behe calls irreducible complexity, and we trace it back to its source in known systems, we always come to a mind, to an engineer. And therefore, the best explanation is that intelligence played a role in the development of systems like this. Now, Behe made this motor famous. It was featured in a film, The Mystery of Life's Origin, which is on display in the back, which made it onto PBS. Behe's book sold over 250,000 copies. He has been savagely criticized for the concept of intelligent design he developed in Darwin's black box. And people have now tried to present the flagellar motor argument as something that's kind of passé. Maybe in the question and answer time we can talk more about the status of that argument. I will defend vigorously the idea that this argument has not been refuted. But people have the sense that, well, the flagellar motor, that's so 1990s, and this is just one isolated example. It's not one isolated example. Inside biology, there are dozens. Inside living cells, there are dozens of these types of molecular machines. There are sliding clamps. There are gated portholes that are information recognition devices that control the flow of information in and out of the cell nucleus. There are even little turbines that are responsible for generating the information that cells use in the process of metabolism. And you have these little turbines at work inside the membranes right now of your mitochondria, an organelle in your cell. And these are just fascinating, guys. They're called ATP synthases. And we've just had an animation rendered of one of these many, but really exquisite examples of molecular machinery. And I'd like to show it to you to give you a little more sense of the evidential basis of the theory of intelligent design. Maybe a tidge loud. Sorry about the fuzz on the narration there. You can go and watch that, animation again and hear the narration a little better on my website, darwinsdoubt.com, if you'd like. But that's, I think you could see the visuals. That is a wonderful depiction of an accurate, fairly accurate depiction of the way these nanomachines are at work right now within the mitochondria of your cells. It's extraordinary, the things that are going on that we take for granted. And so, and like the flagellar motor, this requires an integration of many separate parts and is the type of system that's very difficult to explain by reference to Darwinian evolution. Now, there's another class of evidence in biology that points to intelligent design, one that has fascinated me since I met Charles Thaxton those years ago at that conference I mentioned in the introduction to my talk. When I was a college professor, I used to ask my students a question. If you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? Code, thank you. What else? We could also call it software or information or instructions. All those things would be the correct answer. And it turns out that the same thing is true in life, and this is the great stop-press discovery of late 20th century biology, that information is running the show inside biological systems, that there are literally digitally encoded instructions that are responsible for the constructions of, for example, the protein parts that make up these molecular machines we've been talking about. So if you want to build a new form of life from a simpler pre-existing form of life, you have to have new information, or the evolutionary process would have to generate that information. If you want to build a cell from simpler non-living chemicals, same thing, you've got to have information. Let's just look again back at that bacterial flagellar motor. Notice that U-joint up at the top. The next slide is going to show you how that U-joint is constructed. It's made of smaller subunits that are known as amino acids. Every protein, and all of those molecular machines are made of separate protein parts. Every protein is made of smaller units called amino acids. And there are 20 different amino acids. If they're arranged properly, they will fold into the specific shapes that are required for the proteins to do the jobs they do, whether they're enzymes catalyzing reactions, or whether they are structural parts of machines, or whether they are involved in information processing. Proteins have very specific three-dimensional shapes. And they acquire those shapes as a result of the one-dimensional arrangement of amino acids. But how do the amino acids know how to get arranged? Well, the great discovery of modern molecular biology was the discovery, first of all, of the structure of the DNA molecule. And secondly, the discovery of what the DNA molecule is doing. Watson and Crick, 1953, elucidate the structure of DNA. Inside the DNA molecule, they show that on the outside of the DNA molecule, there's something called a sugar phosphate backbone. On the inside, there are 4 chemicals that Crick later realized are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in the machine code or section of software. This was his famed sequence hypothesis, the idea that what are called the bases, or the nucleotide bases, are functioning like alphabetic characters, and that they are literally sending a message, a section, they're functioning like machine code to tell the cell how to put together all those protein parts, how to arrange those amino acids. So the information stored in the DNA molecule is directing the construction of the proteins and protein machines that the cell needs to stay alive. Now, I come from Seattle, and in Seattle we have both the Microsoft Corporation, which makes a lot of software, but also the Boeing company. And at Boeing, as at many manufacturing centers around the country, they use a technology called CAD/CAM, which is computer-assisted design and manufacture. And the idea of CAD/CAM is you'll have an engineer sitting at a console, and the engineer will write some code for directing a manufacturing apparatus to produce some mechanical part. So maybe at Boeing, the engineer would be writing some code for directing the placement of rivets on an airplane wing. So he'd write the code would go down line, it would be translated into a machine code that could be read by the manufacturing apparatus, and then the rivet arm would put the rivets in the right place in accord with the instructions the engineer had given it, in the form of digital code. This is what's going on, or something very close to it is what's going on inside a living cell. And I have another piece of animation, which I won't show in interest of time tonight, called Journey Inside the Cell. It's also on my website. You might have a look at that as well. It's a great visual of exactly how this process works. But the idea is you've got digital code directing the construction of mechanical parts. Now that creates a huge mystery. The discovery of all this has created a huge mystery. And I call this mystery the Dna Enigma. It's not the mystery of the structure of DNA. Watson and Crick figured that out for us in the 1950s. It's not where the biological information that is sending the instructions resides. We know that as well. A lot of that information resides in the DNA molecule. It's not even what the DNA information does. We do now know how the DNA information is directing the construction of these mechanical or these protein parts. Instead, it's another question. DNA raises a profound question. Anyone? Where did it come from? Where did it come from? Exactly, it's the question of origins. And many leading scientists working on the problem of the origin of the first life have been very explicit about the depth of this conundrum. One German scientist, Bernhard Olaf Küppers, puts it this way: the problem of the origin of life is basically equivalent to the problem of the origin of information, of biological information. You want to build a new cell, you've got to have proteins. To build proteins, you've got to have information stored in DNA. Where's that digital code come from? Now that was the topic that interested my friend Charles Thaxton. And he wrote this book in the mid-'80s called The Mystery of Life's Origin with two other scientists, arguing that no theory of chemical evolution, that's the evolutionary theory that tries to get you from the chemicals to the first cell, had succeeded. He said all of them have failed, and the biggest reason, he argued, that these theories have failed is they have not been able to explain the origin of information. I went off to grad school in 1986, fascinated by this, also intrigued with one of the conclusions that Thaxton and his co-authors drew somewhat tentatively in an epilogue to their book. They argued that information is the kind of thing that we know tends to come from minds. It's a mind product. And so when we're looking at information in the cell, they raise the possibility that we might be looking at evidence of the activity of what they called an intelligent cause. And this seemed very intuitive. After all, for example, Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a computer program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. Well, intuitively, we know that programs come from programmers, and programmers are intelligent agents. So perhaps when we're looking at the information in DNA, Thaxton argued, we're looking at evidence of a designing intelligence. Now, they floated this idea in their book in 1985 in a kind of, on the basis of that kind of intuitive connection between information and intelligence. And I went off to grad school with a burning question in the back of my mind, which was, could this idea, this argument, or could this intuition, rather, be formulated as a rigorous scientific hypothesis? Was it possible to formulate a scientific theory of intelligent design based on the discoveries of the information-bearing properties of DNA? Now, ironically, as I began to study the question of the origin of life, I also was looking closely at the works of Charles Darwin, in part because Darwin had pioneered a scientific method for investigating questions in the remote past. And Darwin understood that if you want to explain the origin of a trilobite, for example, or the first animals, you can't go into the laboratory and make that event happen all over again under controlled laboratory conditions. You have to use a different kind of method, a method more like what geologists or archaeologists use, where you're trying to infer what happened in the past from the clues that are left behind. This form of reasoning is known in historical sciences as inferring to the best explanation. And this is the method of scientific investigation that Darwin pioneered when investigating the remote biological past. He said, in defending his method, and it seems to me that supposing that such an hypothesis, and he's talking about his evolutionary theory of descent with modification, were to explain such general propositions, the facts of biology, We ought, in accord with a common way of reasoning in all the sciences, admit it until some better hypothesis be found out. In other words, we infer that cause which provides the best explanation of the event we're trying to explain. But that raised a big question for me in my mind. And that was, what constitutes the best explanation? What makes an explanation best? And as I dug deeper into the question, I came to the works of one of Darwin's mentors, the great geologist Charles Lyell. And one day I was reading, not deep into the book, but just the title page. And on the title page there was this long, boring Victorian title, The Principles of Geology, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to, and then the nickel dropped for me, by reference to causes now in operation. What was Lyell saying? He's saying that if you want to explain an event in the remote past, the best explanation is going to be one which cites a cause which is known from our present experience to be able to produce the effect in question. Let me give you an example. I went to school in Eastern Washington as an undergraduate. In 1980, there was, well, forget about what happened in 1980, but if you go to Eastern Washington today, there's a layer of white ash about 6 inches deep, still visible in many parts of the Palouse country where they grow the wheat. Now, if you're a geologist and you don't know what happened in 1980, and you come across this layer of white ash, you will use Darwin's method to try to figure out what happened. You will posit many separate hypotheses. And you'll think of different things. Maybe it was an earthquake. Maybe it was a flood. Maybe it was a volcanic eruption. Now, which of those 3 hypotheses is best by reference to Lyell's criterion? What is the cause now in operation? What is the one we know from present experience can produce the effect in question? It's the volcanic eruption, right? We've had experience of volcanoes producing white ash. We have not seen floods or earthquakes do that. So the best explanation is the one that's positing a cause which is known to produce the effect we're trying to explain. And suddenly it hit me. What is the cause now in operation for the production of digital code? What is the cause that we see at work today producing information? It's intelligence, right? It's mind. Minds do that. Undirected chemical processes don't do that. And so this problem that Thaxton and many other scientists had highlighted as a reason for doubting these theories of chemical evolutionary theory, namely we don't know of a cause which can produce the information necessary to get life going, also pointed in the direction of a possible solution. It wasn't just a problem for evolutionary theory. I now realize that you could formulate a positive theory of intelligent design because there is a cause of which we know from our present experience that is capable of generating information, and that cause is intelligence. In fact, it is the only known cause of the origin of information. And not long after I began to think in this manner, I came across a passage from an early pioneer in the application of information theory to molecular biology. In other words, a guy analyzing the code in DNA using the tools of modern information science. And he said this, he said, the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. It's a presently acting cause. It's a cause now in operation. Conscious activity generates information, and we know of no other cause. And so I realized it was possible to infer intelligent design as a best explanation using the same method of reasoning that Darwin himself had used. Is Henry Quasler correct? Is information habitually associated with conscious activity? Well, think about it for a second. Whenever we see an information-rich system, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a section of software or a paragraph in a book or even information embedded in a radio signal, we always come, if we trace the information back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. This is kind of a funny cartoon. Some of you may know about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's an actual scientific research program where scientists are looking for evidence of intelligence embedded in radio signals. What are they looking for? Information-rich modulated signals. So the principle that information is pointing back to intelligence is accepted even by people who don't want to accept the idea of intelligent design. And this little cartoon says, as I read it, these are some SETI researchers looking for that intelligence in space, and they get a signal in it, and they say, as I read it, we're receiving a message from outer space telling us to stop bombarding them with unintelligible messages. Okay, anyway, I have developed this argument for intelligent design based on information in my book, Signature in the Cell. In developing that argument, I also draw on the work of my good colleague, Bill Dembski, who will be speaking next, who will take you take this discussion even deeper. Tomorrow, I'll be talking about my book, Darwin's Doubt, which develops an argument for intelligent design as a direct challenge to Darwinian evolution, not just chemical evolutionary theories of the origin of life. And I'll be looking at an event in the history of life there known as the Cambrian explosion, where the first animals arise, which turns out also to be an event in which a huge infusion of new information comes into the biosphere. But for now, let's just go back to that question I asked at the beginning. What is intelligent design, and why does it inspire such determined efforts to suppress it? Is it a faith-based system of thought? Is it a faith-based idea, as Time magazine said? Is it creationism 2.0? Is it creationism in a cheap tuxedo? Is it religion, not science? All the things you've heard in the media. I would argue in each case, no. Instead, intelligent design is based on two things: scientific evidence and the application of a standard method of scientific reasoning, in fact, the very method of reasoning that Darwin himself used in The Origin of Species. The evidence, we've talked about some of it. Complex molecular machinery and circuitry. I didn't talk about the circuits. The discovery of digital information and information processing systems in the cell and in animals. The discovery of the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics. 3 separate classes of evidence that we argue all point to intelligent design as the best explanation. But it's also based on inferences that are based on our knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world, what we see nature, what we see intelligent agents doing in our present experience. So the basis of intelligent design is evidential. It's not based on faith. It's not based on religious doctrine. It's not based on the Bible. It's not based on the Quran. It's based on scientific evidence and the use of a standard method of scientific reasoning. For that reason, I think it's legitimate to say it's a scientific theory. It's not a faith-based idea. In the case of Anthony Flew, the atheist who came to believe in some kind of a designer or creator because of the evidence of intelligent design, is a great illustration of this. You can't say that Anthony Flew came to intelligent design on the basis of religious faith. He was explicitly opposed to religious faith until he saw the evidence from biology and cosmology pointed him in a new direction. So don't be confused by a common media trope. What the media likes to do is say, intelligent design, here's the trick. It's important to distinguish the basis of intelligent design from its implications. If you come to the conclusion that there is a designing intelligence responsible for life in the universe, that is going to raise another question, a philosophical question about the identity of that designer. You may even conclude that the designer is God. But that is an implication of the inference that you're making first from the evidence. So in defending the theory of intelligent design against the claim that it's religion or it's faith-based, we have had to impress upon the media this distinction between the basis of the theory and the implications of the theory. Now that came home to all of us this week in relation to this conference. There was an article in the Huffington Post criticizing this conference and criticizing those of us speaking here for being duplicitous and sneaky and all around bad people, because while we say we think the theory of intelligent design is based on science, here we are, Bill Dembski, Steve Meyer, Bruce Gordon, here those guys are speaking in a church. And the church has said this idea of intelligent design is important for defending some basic Christian doctrines. See, they're going back on it. It's not really science, it's religion. It's Christianity dressed up in it. Well, again, separate the two things, the basis of the theory from its implications. It is a basic Christian doctrine, and I speak not only as a proponent of intelligent design, but also as a Christian, that there is a creator and therefore a designer of the universe. So intelligent design provides support for that idea. Jews believe that as well. But the basis of the idea is not in Christian theology. This isn't a deduction from religious authority. It is an inference from biological evidence that happens to provide support for a theological proposition. And the media wants to merge all that together. I was once on a program with Abrams, not Elliot Abrams, he's the defense guy, Dan Abrams on MSNBC. And he kept badgering me with two questions in rapid succession. Is it religion? And who do you think the designer is? And see, what the trick was is to get me to say, well, I personally think the designer is God. And then he'd say, well, then admit it, it's religion. No, it's not based on religion, which is what you want to say, because if you think you can say it's based on religion, then in our culture that means it's a fantasy. And we want to say, no, it's not just about faith, it's about the facts. Okay? So the basis of the theory of intelligent design is not faith-based, it's fact-based, though it may have implications that support faith. Okay? Now, two quick implications of intelligent design. One, it clearly challenges a materialistic worldview. If you've been watching the Cosmos series that's being replayed now with a new narrator on Fox News, opening statement of that program was, the universe is all there is and all there was and all there ever will be. That's the materialistic worldview. Matter and energy, the stuff out of which the universe is composed, are eternal, self-existent, and self-creating. No mind behind it, no creator behind it, no designer. Clearly, the theory of intelligent design challenges that worldview. It also does provide support for a theistic worldview, though it does not prove the Christian faith in its entirety. It provides support for a tenet of Judeo-Christian faith, which is that there is a designing intelligence behind the universe. In one of the Psalms it says, in wisdom thou hast created all things. So, based on science, but it does have positive implications, faith-affirming implications. And I think that also explains why people are working so hard to suppress this theory. In the academic world today, the dominant worldview is the materialistic worldview, the worldview that says matter and energy are the whole show. Every worldview has to answer the question, what is the thing or the entity from which everything else comes? And the materialistic worldview says the thing or the entity from which everything else comes is matter and energy and material processes such as natural selection and random mutation. We're challenging the sufficiency of that account of how everything got here. And therefore, we're not just challenging a scientific theory, we're challenging a comprehensive worldview that for many scientists functions as something like a secular religion. And when you challenge those kinds of belief systems, you get pushback. And many scientists think it is their duty to limit science to strictly materialistic explanations. So when Sternberg published my paper, or when any of these other scientists have advanced intelligent design, many scientists regard them as doing something that's against science, that's violating the core principles of science, and they feel justified in persecuting them. So there is really not only an evidential argument about what the evidence says, what the best explanation of the evidence is, but in the debate about intelligent design, there's an underlying worldview conflict, and there is a debate about the very nature of science. Must it be limited to strictly material processes, or might there be something else? And that's what we'll be discussing this whole weekend. So I thank you very much for your attention.